The year 1966 means different things for different people. For Britain, it was the year of swinging London, when the capital was at the forefront of fashion and culture, and a year of celebration when England won the World Cup in their football match against West Germany. For America, it was a year of disapproval and anger as the war in North Vietnam escalated, as more ground troops entered the country and the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong were bombed. But for the Beatles, I think the best way to describe 1966 is an artistic nightmare. Brian Epstein had planned out the year nearly identical to the previous 2 years. Start work on movie and album in February, including singles, then a world tour, followed by an American tour in the summer, and then another album for the Christmas period. But immediately, there were problems. The Beatles, who had hated making their previous film Help, were not interested in working on another film and were turning down script ideas, including a cowboy film, and later on, one from Joe Orton, one of the most celebrated and most controversial playwriter of the 1960s, in which the Beatles were depicted as anarchic adulterers who end up in an orgy at the end with the same woman. Since no deals could be made, the Beatles' third film for United Artists had to be put on hold, and since Epstein couldn't book anything else in that slot, it meant that the Beatles were allowed a 3-month break, their longest since 1962. George Harrison took advantage of the break and became the third Beatle to tie the knot when he and Pattie Boyd were married on the 21st of January. Paul McCartney was the only Beatle to attend the wedding, serving as best man alongside Brian Epstein. John Lennon and Ringo Starr had gone off on holiday with their wives. Paul, during this time, had managed to move out of the spare room of Jane Asher's family home and into his own house, St John's Wood in Cavendish Avenue, so that he could be closer to the theatres and galleries in central London. However, this luxury ended when the Beatles returned to Abbey Road in April to work on material for their 7th album, in which the thought process was, okay, so Rubber Soul was successful and demonstrated what we could do in the studio. Let's see if we can go further. John's Tomorrow Never Knows was the first song to demonstrate what they meant by further. John was by now an avid taker of LSD, and he had been reading a book called The Psychedelic Experience by Dr. Timothy Leary, based off the text of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he wanted to try and replicate the sound of a Tibetan monk ritual. The song was, in a way, a culmination of the techniques that would be used for the rest of the album. It incorporated backwards guitar, Indian instruments like the tambora were used, John's voice was distorted when it was put through a Leslie speaker, and the sound of tape loops were being fed into different tape machines around the studios while being made to fade in and out of each other at the mixing desk. Tomorrow Never Knows also incorporated a brand new effect created by technical engineer Ken Townsend called automatic double tracking, or ADT. Basically, by running an additional tape machine, you could duplicate vocals or instruments from the original master tapes, and if you delayed it by a fraction of a second, you gave the impression that 2 voices were being heard from just one recording. ADT saved the Beatles loads of recording time because it was now no longer necessary to use another track for double tracking, and was a process that was soon adopted throughout the recording industry. Aside from George Martin, one of the key members who had worked on all the Beatles albums had been Norman Smith as chief engineer. But by 1966 he had become a producer himself, so they hired 20-year-old Geoff Emerick to take his place. Like Martin, Emerick embraced the experimental excitement the Beatles were on and helped in whatever way he could to get the right sound the Beatles wanted. One of those was for Rain, the B-side to the chosen single, Paperback Writer, when John wanted to play the end of the song backwards on the tape after he had accidentally put his own home recording in the tape machine backwards. Another song of his, I'm Only Sleeping, used an interesting backwards guitar sound in which George Harrison deliberately composed and recorded his guitar sections with an idea of how it would sound when put through the machine. Emmerich also helped in making Ringo's drumming sound much heavier by putting fabric into the bass drum and, against EMI's safety regulations, moved the microphone 3 inches closer towards it. While their next album is often considered their best, this current one, later titled as Revolver, can also be seen as the Beatles' masterpiece due to the high production value and quality of songs, including the string octet on Paul's Eleanor Rigby. Ah, look at all the lonely people. The first real steps into Indian music on George's Love You Too. So fast, I turn around, it's past. The surreal innocence of the Ringo standard, Yellow Submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine, yellow submarine, yellow submarine. And the hard-hitting satire of George's Taxman, a song which mocked the ridiculous super tax law on the rich that the government was imposing at the time. If you drive a car, I'll tax the street. If you try to sit, I'll tax your seat. If you get too cold, I'll tax the heat. If you take a walk, I'll tax your feet. There were even some clear references to drugs like LSD and its influences with Dr. Robert and She Said, She Said. In fact, Revolver is really the start of the Beatles' psychedelic era, which would only continue for the next 2 albums. The musical arrangement on these songs was so complex that for the time, it would have been physically impossible to replicate them on stage, so none of the 14 songs were incorporated into their live shows while on tour that year. Oh yeah, now we're getting into the meat of things. After Paperback Writer reached number 1 in the chart on the 30th of May, and they were just finishing work on Revolver after nearly 3 months straight, it was time for them to get back to their monotonous touring schedule, and let me tell you couldn't have picked a worse set of circumstances. In Germany, the hysterical fans were treated with violence by the police who used tear gas and guard dogs against them, and when they arrived in Japan, many right-wing traditionalists protested and sent death threats to the Beatles as they were booked to play in the Budokan Hall, which was only ever used for traditional martial arts tournaments. The security was high as well, as the Beatles were kept locked in their suite and were never allowed to venture outside of it, although once or twice they did manage to get out. But honestly, that was just a warm-up for what happened in the Philippines. Upon landing in Manila Airport, the Beatles were thrown into a car and driven away, leaving Brian Epstein, Neil Aspinall, Mal Evans and Tony Barrow, their press officer at the time, standing on the runway with all their luggage, which was all full of pot. They were soon discovered to have been taken to a private yacht for, I can only think of it being a private performance, until their entourage managed to get them off the yacht and to the hotel. But that's not the end of it. The Philippines at the time was under the rule of the newly elected president Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda, and she had instructed that the Beatles were to give them a private performance at the Malacanang Palace. Except no one had told the Beatles this arrangement, and when Imelda's security staff came to collect them, they were still in bed, and Epstein, who had already said that they would not be able to attend, said that they were not to be disturbed. This caused a national scandal as the front page of the newspapers the next morning announced that the Beatles had snubbed the first family, and all hell was let loose. Epstein tried to make a public statement explaining the situation, but just before his apology could be heard, the sound became distorted and the live feed was suddenly cut. Finally, Epstein told the Beatles quite simply, "Get packed, we're getting the hell out of here." But it seemed like the whole country had now turned against them. The cavalcade of cars that had brought them to the hotel was now reduced to 1. They were refused permission to leave the country without paying income tax for their concerts. even though they hadn't been paid yet, and when they finally made it to the airport, the escalators had been switched off and they were forced to carry all their equipment while being beaten and kicked by angered Filipinos as they forced their way to the aeroplane, but they were still not permitted to leave as some legal documents concerning Mal Evans and Tony Barrow were thought to be fake, and then an hour later they were finally allowed to leave, all battered and bruised. This was the moment that the Beatles decided enough was enough, and they told Brian Epstein on the plane to the stop-off point in India that they refused to go on tour ever again. But they still needed to get America out of the way, and at least America still loved them. Then they hear that Americans were now burning their albums. The Beatles had already dealt with some controversy over in America earlier that year. Capitol, the company that published the Beatles' albums in America, had a rather unorthodox method of handling them. Whenever a new Beatles album was released, they would remove several songs from it and put them to the side so that they could make an entirely new album from those songs as a means to make more money. The Beatles never really objected to this practice until it came to Rubber Soul and Revolver, but there was nothing they could do except pose for the covers for them. This particular cover for the album Yesterday and Today had the Beatles dressed in white butcher smocks surrounded by meat and decapitated dolls, and when Capitol announced this cover they were bombarded with complaints, and so a week before the album was due out they had to make a friendlier version. Because of this, Yesterday and Today had actually lost Capitol about $200,000. But let's face it, we all know what the real controversy was. Maureen Cleave was a journalist for the Evening Standard and had been a close friend of the Beatles for years, especially with John Lennon. During an interview for her weekly articles on the Beatles published in March 1966, John was quoted as saying, "Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved I'm right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." This statement provoked no reaction in Britain, since that was the attitude that many had, as the Christian faith was in decline at that time. However, over in America, where Christianity was and still is prevalent, the quote was taken out of context and the reaction was insane. Many radio stations banned the Beatles songs from playing, and across the Bible Belt, public bonfires were set up so that people could burn their Beatles trash in protest against the blasphemy of the Beatles thinking they were bigger than Jesus. The whole fiasco completely overshadowed the release of Revolver on the 5th of August, with its unique cover design by Klaus Voormann, the Beatles' old friend from their Hamburg days, as well as the double A-sided single Yellow Submarine and Eleanor Rigby. Still, they both reached number 1, though I believe that was just so they could burn them rather than just ignore them. Brian Epstein came close to cancelling the US tour, but decided to go with it anyway. John was naturally terrified when he was forced to make a public apology at a press conference in Chicago, Illinois, and to explain what he meant.
I was pointing out that fact in reference to England, that we meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it as a fact. I'm not saying that we're better or greater, or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. You know, I just said what I said and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
This did quell the fires, but not by much, as Memphis almost cancelled the Beatles' concerts that they had been booked, and the Ku Klux Klan were declaring vengeance. It's no wonder why the Beatles wanted to stop touring. It was no longer just boring, it was downright life-threatening at this point. Ringo actually recalls crying for his mother at one point because of the fear that one of them might get killed during all this. They honestly didn't care at this point, as their performances were dreadful, as they hadn't bothered to rehearse at all for the tours, but since no one could hear them, it didn't matter. John Lennon recalls when he would sing Twist and Shout, he would change the lyrics to "I'm pissed with gout," and nobody noticed. Soon the end came when, after performing at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on the 29th of August on the Cage stage and climbing into the armoured car, that the Beatles' touring days were over. Everyone close to them got the sense that things were going to change, as the Beatles made no plans to work with each other for 3 months, meaning that 1966 was simultaneously their most creative year and also their least creative year, since they only made 16 songs that year, as opposed to the 30 the previous year. This, of course, left them free to pursue their own interests. John had gone to Spain for 6 weeks to appear in Richard Lester's latest comedy film, How I Won the War, playing Musketeer Gripweed, a soldier under the command of Michael Crawford's Lieutenant Goodbody. The most significant thing in relation to the Beatles with this film was that this was the first time John began to wear his now iconic granny glasses, as they would later be referred to. It was even during this break that he first met a certain Japanese-American avant-garde artist. But we'll get to her later. Paul was also involved in the movie industry, working with George Martin to create the soundtrack for The Family Way, a comedy-drama film by the famous Bolting brothers. George, who had always hated his Beatle existence and considered touring degrading for a serious musician, disappeared to India with Patty for 2 months to continue his growing interest in the Hindu religion and to perfect his sitar playing under the guidance of Ravi Shankar. Ringo, however, was the only one content with just staying at home with his wife Maureen and his son Zach, who had been born the previous year, though he did go and visit John while he was filming. However, despite all these different interests, there was still a deep affection for each other and no desire to go solo yet, which was why, towards the end of November, the Beatles returned to Abbey Road with new ideas, new looks, and, unbeknownst to them and the world, a new era. But I think we should pause once more to look at the early days of the quiet Beatle, George Harrison.